Meteor Impact.
Welcome everybody. I'm Mike King. I've been developing in Meteor since I forget how long. It was a while ago. Started in Angular and then switched to React. And basically that's kind of what we do. We're a small company and we just do Meteor stuff. All right, just before I start talking about my particular subject, I'd just like to shout out a big thank you to the Meteor community. Like the version 3 has been a massive, difficult upgrade. You know, it's high risk in terms of you've got an app that runs and then all of a sudden things don't work. We've spent 12 months on one app, on just one app. The other ones we probably never do, just because it's so much effort. Min Nguyen did some bulk conversion thing. I pushed him into writing some code for us and he did that and contributed it back. And we got there and we've got our customer now live on version 3, which is great. You know, I mean, it's been difficult, but, you know, appreciate the effort. And I haven't really contributed much myself. I've been busy just dealing with our own stuff and trying to migrate Meteor in the background. So, you know, and I'm sure that there'll be similar stories from other people that it's a load, you know, to do that. And then there's one little sting in the tail that I think that async await is actually evil. I did read an article about it that says the problem is that it infects everything. So if one piece of code has to await something, then the thing that calls that has to await that one. And it goes back up the chain until every method and function in your system becomes async. And it's like, well, that kind of defeats the purpose. And I think, to be honest, that the Meteor, well, no, actually it's not Meteor. The JavaScript community has adopted async await. And in fact, it's even gone to things like Python. You know, Python, one of the delights of Python was that it was a really simple language and you could just write code and things work. And Meteor was kind of like that as well. And now even Python has gone to async await. And I think that the downside is that the whole world is now having to code around async await, and it doesn't make us more productive. It makes us less productive, and it introduces all kinds of issues. And I think that, I mean, I can't fix it myself, but I think that there will be another step change at some point where we'll just get away from this because it's a pain in the neck. Anyway, that's my 10 cents. All right, so let's talk about testing, and I'll just back up a little bit to sort of talk about justification. So testing is necessary because, you know, you need to make sure it works. It ends up reducing your costs if you test properly. It gives you a more reliable system. Security is better and user experience is better. And there's a kind of rule that I have that the more software you write, the more you need to have testing and automated testing as well. Because if you don't write that, then you exponentially get more and more work to do. Every time you do a release of the software, then it takes you more time to do manual testing. And of course, manual testing is very unreliable because you forget what you have to do, or you have all these scripts that you run and then it's boring because you've got to work your way through, you know, hours and hours of testing to get a new release out. Anyway, so let's just look at the different types of testing. So unit testing is neat, small units, it's repeatable, things are isolated, there's no side effects, and it's easy to automate. So, you know, you can have a button that you click and, you know, it says hello world, and you can test that. And that's really easy, really nice. And you can write lots and lots of low-level unit tests, and that's fine, but it doesn't really solve the problem of the application testing or end-to-end testing. So if we go to integration testing and or system testing, it's about testing systems in their entirety and how they work together. And this is the more difficult thing to do. And it's quite hard to do this because typically there's sequences of operations and there's a lot of data required to get you to the point where you can actually test it. So yeah, it's kind of a difficult, complicated problem, and particularly if you test across different systems as well. So it's like, well, you know, we've given you access to something using OAuth, and then you need to go to another system and use that to actually log into it, and then you get an email from some other system. So, you know, it gets really complicated pretty quickly. Anyway, so just stepping back to Meteor's integration tests, you know, there's a thing there and you go, oh, great, there's some integration testing. But when you look at it, it's maybe not that great. But let's look at what it is. So it uses the Mocha framework, which is fairly standard, and that's good. And you can use the database. So you can reset the data. You can use factories for mocking up your data. And it means that the code you're testing is closer to real. You're not having to do all kinds of convoluted things with mocks because it's actually in the database. And you can therefore test Meteor methods and functions, which is good. So it's a step up from not having any testing. And it does support async. So you can do the async await, sort of, and there are some gotchas in that. Anyway, so looking at what it is, in my view, then the Mocha integration testing is really like a unit test because there's some pretty strict rules around it that the test must be atomic. The tests can't really depend on each other. And if you put the debugger on and stop it, then it kind of changes all of the timing and then it causes all the tests to fail. And if you end up with hundreds or thousands of tests in your system, it takes a long time to run through all those, and it's sort of like clumsy to just zoom in on one area. And if you know, when we were doing the Meteor 3 upgrade, we went from having 300 and something tests that mostly passed to all of them that failed. And it's like, oh shit, this is a big deal to start working through each and every test. And of course, the tests had to be upgraded because they needed to do async calls as well. So anyway, I mean, that's another bit of a gripe. And then Mocha grep is kind of good because you can zoom in on just one thing, but it does change what happens as well because it, and in fact, let me just talk on the next slide about the execution cycle for Mocha is sort of restrictive. And if you look at this code, then you can see that it looks sort of innocuous. There's a describe, and then I've got a let in there, and I've got a before, which runs before. And then these let variables are updated in the before function, and then they're used, like the users are set up in the it block, then it uses those. The problem with this is, and it sort of works, but it's not perfect, is that Mocha has this to-pass thing where it basically parses all of the code and it runs the describe functions. And the befores and the its are basically hooks that it then runs at some time later. And the order of those, of the execution of those, well, the before obviously needs to go before, but the its don't necessarily run in order that they're on the page. So it makes doing any kind of complicated testing more difficult. You can do simple testing like this, but it makes the more complex stuff harder. And I've been butting my head up against this for the longest time since I started writing these Mocha tests. So that was kind of my driver for saying I'm frustrated with this because I try to set up a scenario and I try to do a sequence of operations, you know, like create a user, add them to this job, assign them to this task, get them to do something, get somebody else to do something. And it basically is almost impossible with Mocha because it fights you at every step of the way and it goes, I don't want to do this, or I'll run things in the different order, and those global variables you're putting in there don't really work properly, or they're not set at the right time. So I started writing my own test framework. And the idea is that it can, and I've got it sort of running, I'll show you shortly. It can do simple tests, same kind of stuff that Mocha does, and it can do complex sequences of operations. And that's kind of the winner for me. Timeouts don't apply with this. It's easy to debug. The approach is similar to Mocha, but not quite the same. And the output is similar and compatible with Mocha test results, although I haven't really gone into test reporting or anything. And the tests are always available. They don't need to be run separately, because basically with Mocha, you need to invoke the Meteor testing thing, and it runs a completely separate Meteor process with a local database that's just in local Mongo, and it doesn't persist. So it's just a transient kind of thing. So with this one, you can use your app as normal. So let's just have a look at the files that are the core files. Now, this isn't a package yet. Maybe it can be at some point. So there's a handful of files that is the machinery for all this. And I've got an idea in there that one import will basically enable the whole of this end-to-end testing. And when I deploy to production, I switch this file to be disabled. And then it means that all of those tests don't get bundled in with the actual production build and go on. There may be a better way to do that, but that kind of works for me for the moment. All right, you invoke it with a CLI. Basically, you give it an area which is similar to your Mocha grep thing. The script checks with the server to see whether that area you've selected is available, and then it invokes a method on the server to actually run it, and then it saves the results to a file. There are two Meteor methods that the files provide. One is e2e list.tests, which gives you a list, so that if you want to do a help output, then you can basically list all the tests that are available, and then you can run a particular test. The test files themselves live in a folder, and that's sort of by convention. I mean, you can put them anywhere you want. I've got a server e2e, and then each project has its own folder. I mean, you can organize that into areas of testing. You could test the user authentication in one module, you could test emails in another, and so on. Basically, each of those files, so there's an e2e Excel and the e2e boss delete, which is highlighted. That's the one we're going to look at today. So at the bottom of the file, you do an export, a default export that basically has a set of steps, and those steps are data within. So there's a method there, and then there's a slug to identify and a name just for human readability. So you need to provide that, and then you've got a before function. So you notice in here there's a before at line 241. Oops, and then this is the before function that gets called. We've got a clean database. We generate some regular stuff, and then we do an async call to a Meteor method. And then in the actual code itself, so if we go back here, we see that RMB1 is the first of those, delete boss one. So actually this one's called RMB2, sorry, my bad. But basically there's a cache.info. So this cache is the context that's passed through to everything. And then you do some work, like you find a person, and then you do a Meteor call async to do this remove person.job, and you pass in some data, and then you then find a participant in the database, and you start looking at this cache.expecting. So it's like the Mocha expect, and it's basically got 4 parameters. One is a description, then there's the data, and then some kind of comparison operator, and then a value. So you're basically looking that the number of bosses should equal 0. That's what we're expecting to see. And then the next line is we're looking, the participant name has no document. So you look at their document. So you can write as many of those tests as you like, and you can intersperse code in between those things. And this all goes from top to bottom. So you can write as many, as simple or as complex code as you like. And you can debug this stuff as well. So you basically set a breakpoint on it and you can step through it. This is the output that comes to the CLI console itself. So you've got a terminal session that you run, and then there's just some debug output. It tells you what it's doing, and it's planning to do this, and it runs it. And there's a failed there. I think I failed, could not find a boss for Kevin Stack. It's interesting. And then on the Meteor console itself, it gives you an output as well, which is not as rich. This one has colors. I use chalk in there to pretty the output. In the Meteor console, it's just plain, but you get the message of the tests are passing or failing in there. And then the test data is actually stored in a JSON file, and that's compatible with the Mocha test reporter stuff. I haven't really spent much time playing with those things. In my perfect world, I'll write some stuff that will run 1,000 tests and then do some kind of report on it to tell me what's passed and failed. Haven't got there yet. There are some side effects which are actually good. The factories create real data in your local database, and that's actually useful for testing, because what I typically do is I say, well, I created this test to test a particular thing. I'll use that to give me some test data, and it saves me any amount of time from a minute to 10 minutes of keying and entering all that data. And it's also running a test along the way. So it's very useful like that. You can also set your breakpoints and you can inspect, troubleshoot, and it just saves lots of time in that, setting up the test cases. All right, current status is, I'm way ahead of time on this, apologies, but we can spend some time poking around with it and you can ask questions if you like. It's a work in progress, but it is usable. I've got maybe 100 tests in this space. There's room for improvement always. It's not a package yet. It could be, I suppose. At the moment, it doesn't handle exceptions or timeouts or all of the Mocha operators. There's a little place where you can add them. I've basically just added the basic ones, and you can go and edit that and add some more lines of code to do that. I'm not sure whether timeouts are actually necessary. I haven't felt a need for it. I mean, it's one of the things that Mocha does, and you end up falsely extending the timeouts because it annoys you that they fail because it takes too long, and it's probably database operations that are taking too long. So I haven't found that test timeouts are actually that useful. And the exception stuff, you could argue whether it's useful to force an exception. I mean, that's something that could be added in. I just haven't seen a strong driver for that. So let me switch to, I'll go off full screen. We'll go and have a look at it. So in this test that I run, have I got, yeah. So if I run this test, it logs into the server, it calls the function, and then I get this output there that it's basically worked 100%. And if we look at the code for it, a bit smaller, it's really quite straightforward. This is remove boss 2, or that's the remove boss 1. I make heavy use of factories in all this stuff, and that's probably an important factor. It takes time to set up the factories. Like, it's sort of tedious to start with, but once you've started creating factories, then they pay you back. And I guess it's the same with the testing too, that you build the tools and then it makes it easier for you to write more. Here we've got this thing where this one we're doing an await of before. And then we've got a function here called add Zimmerman. Let's add a person. And then I think I've got some add Zim boss. So I'm adding a boss to Zimmerman. So if we go and have a look at that, then there's some code between there. When I generate this incoming and I pass it data. So this is the data here to add the boss, from an external system that I'm syncing with. So, there's sort of layers of stuff there, and the factories are kind of critical in being able to make the thing simple. And then you can call your Meteor methods, and then you can write your code. And I've even got this stuff here that actually is a utility message test that digs into the messages in the system. So if I go to the actual data here, and we can look at Bob Zimmerman has one boss, Zebedee, that's been added. And if I run the other test, B2, I'm not sure if this works. Okay. I'll run both the boss 1 and boss 2 tests. There can be dependencies between the 2 units within the one test. These test 2 basically depends on test 1. So if I go back to the workshops and I have a look at this data, so Barb Zimmerman actually has no bosses now. Yeah, because the test was to remove both bosses. So it's kind of useful to be able to look at that data. And then we even do stuff like we even fill in forms and then process the data and get reports out of the system. And all of that would take hours and hours and hours of manual testing to get to that same point. So that's kind of where it is. I'm open for questions. Does anybody want to ask anything?
Go ahead, Aaron. You can unmute yourself and ask a question. Aaron, you are unmuted, but we don't hear anything unless it's...
Got no sound, yeah.
So maybe check your settings, and that doesn't work. Reconnect is also an option, or the chat as well.
So if I specify a bad area, it then gives me a list of all of the areas and all of the only things that I can do within that. So I could say, well, there's a forgot password that I want to run here. So I run the forgot password test and it's all passed. And then if I go to my application, it's a good question. No workshop. So it's deleted the data. I'm not sure which user that was for. Let me find another one to test or reminders. We've got a problem in that name is required. Okay.
Okay, Mike, questions. Yeah. Is this available on GitHub? You said there is no package yet, and tied to that, just to finish up, how are the plans to kind of make it into a package?
Yeah, good question. I'm happy to share it, and make it open source, obviously. It could maybe be put in a package. There's a little bit of, there's like a command line interface. What I think I might do is create a small Meteor project and put it in that, and then people can have a look at it. And, we could get together and say, well, how do we make this a bit more general purpose for everybody? I've got a wiki here which talks about how it works, what the files are, how to log in, that tweak with optimizing the bundle, how the CLI works. The writing test is still to be written. So yeah, I was hoping to get all that ready before today, but it's just been a busy week for me. Aaron, it doesn't control the web browser. We use Cypress for that. Cypress does a pretty good job, so I didn't feel the need to reproduce that. It's more of a server-side testing framework, but it's more than just unit. Well, it's like it's unit testing, but it's higher level than that, because you can run a sequence of operations, and you can check each operation along the way. I mean, it really is mostly useful when you've got the code working and finished. But then again, you can write your tests. I mean, a good tester or a good developer will write tests first, and it fails on the first step, and they write the code, and then it starts working. So you can definitely do that test-driven development approach. There's a question. In your case, you had 300 tests in Mocha, but upgrading from Meteor 2 to 3, they all failed. Yeah, basically because any function call needed an await on it. So at the very least, we needed to go and put awaits in there. But then often the methods that they were calling didn't work either, because they needed some work. I mean, as you probably know, it gets complicated very quickly, because if you've done a for each loop or a map, then it doesn't work anymore with async. So you basically have to do a for variable of list, and then you iterate over that, and then you can do your awaits, or you do this promise.all, and you do a map async and return the promise. So it's sort of non-trivial doing upgrades, and it just adds to the burden if you've got all of these code to fix, and then the tests don't even work on their own, so you can't use them to test the async functions. So it was a big problem. And we weren't really using much callback stuff, like it was all synchronous calls. Yeah, and kind of my intention was that I would gradually migrate those Mocha style tests into this framework, because it just made it easier for me to write those sort of codes. It's almost like it was a freedom from all of the restrictions and this sort of weird timing stuff between the describe block and the if blocks, and then the disconnect between multiple if blocks that they didn't run in order. So you got weird behavior, because sometimes the tests would work and then sometimes they wouldn't, because of those timing issues. How will you name it? Good question. Well, I'm calling it e2e myself, so we can adopt that, or if you want to think of a name, feel free.
If anybody has suggestions for names, I think now is a good time to add them into the chat as well, maybe as a reply to my question.
Yeah. And I've got a question for everyone in the room. Like, how useful do you think this could be for you as an application developer?
Mike, if you want, under the plus, there is an option for a poll. So instead of people replying in the chat,
Sure.
we cannot do a poll. So let's use that, have some fun.
Deterministic testing program. So if we then go to the application and have a look, fine. Then here, I think you can look at notifications. So basically that's part of what that code here was looking for. Oh, actually there was an error on a duplicate. So there was if I go to the specials outgoing notifications, something went wrong. So this email was sent out as a result of this duplicate person being added to the system. So yeah, look, it's an interesting thing that this becomes a tool that you can use to help develop and test the system, you know. And then if a user reports some problems, then you can just say, well, I'll pick this test because that's similar to what they were doing, and get yourself some data up and running and say, well, does it fail at this point? Or if I go in and I can now change something, go into the workshop and say, well, I want to actually have a look at this person, and go in and make a change to the people or the notifications. So, you know, and I guess it's a level of maturity of the software that the application works well, and then the tools around it work well as well.
Mike, question, will this, you said it runs as part as the regular application.
Yeah.
So if I'm correct, then it also, if you have like database operation, it changes the data on your local testing as well. Would it be also possible to run this, say, in the Meteor test mode as well, so that we can have it in its own database?
Yeah, you could. Yeah, look, there's no reason why not. I haven't tried that, but I also don't see a lot of need for it. One of the things that we've done, it took a bit of time, and I may have talked about it in the last Meteor Impact as well, the concept of having fixtures. I've got two things in the system. There's a thing called fixtures, and there's a thing called assets. We run one system, one core package for 3 different applications that have similar, well, there's some crossover between them. And basically the fixtures are things like your system users, and your basic, your roles and things that are part of the plumbing. And then you say, well, the assets are actually like the user workflows or the email templates, because those email templates are branded for that customer. So we've segregated all of those asset type things into a separate database, and we've built tools around being able to manage those, such that you can then say, well, all of these assets belong to this project, and we've got a little command line script that says, well, squirt these into my current local database. I'll squirt in the fixtures, which give me some users and get me started, and then I squirt in assets that are relevant for the application that I'm testing, and then I can run the tests after that. So we treat the database as a very transient thing. You know, it's just like you can drop it and recreate it in a heartbeat. So we don't tend to stick with long-term data in our local database. Like, it's all just set and forget. Now, there is one huge risk, of course, that you run that wipe database method on your production server. I did that once, but I've got a hook in there now to make sure that you cannot do this in production. Yeah, because I found one of the annoying things with the Mocha testing was that once the thing had finished, then the data was gone, and it was kind of difficult to look at it. Whereas if you have it in as a sort of semi-permanent thing, then you can poke around in the data or use the data for your own manual testing or development purposes as you go.
So if I understand correctly, this allows you, so if the test fails or gets stuck somewhere, you can actually then go in and manually check, okay, what is the problem here? Is that correct assumption?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, so you can even set breakpoints inside your e2e function. So you can set a breakpoint here to have a look at it. You can stop at it and go, well, what the heck is coming back in this boss? You know, why is this filter not working, for example? So it's quite a smooth experience in terms of developing, that these tests become part of your code base, as it were. I've got a utility, given that we've got a little bit of extra time. I have this concept of copying a job. So for example, let's say that this is my production system. And then if I go to workshops and I go to this guy, I can get this ID and I can say, all right, what I want to do is say node scripts, copy job, server equals ekit.console. So I basically give it the job ID, and it then contacts the server. It does a Meteor call on it to get all of the database, all the data, and then it saves it to a set of local files, one for each participant. So we've got a bunch of people that are sitting inside this, and there's a workflow for each one of them. And I've got all of those local, and I can then load this by copying and pasting this command. It then loads it into my local database. So that's my production system. And then this is the local one. And then all of a sudden I've got this workshop here loaded on my local system. Now, one of the things this does for safety, obviously, it puts a .fake on the end of the email address, such that if the system wants to send an email, then it doesn't go to the real person, because that's another bit of embarrassing moment. But yeah, there's a lot of power in being able to just, and it's one of the beauties of using Mongo as opposed to using a relational database, that it's really quite easy to take related objects and documents and copy them into JSON, put them in, save them in a file, and then load them in. And there's just two parts of the script, one to load and one to unload. And then, you know, you've got a lot of power because all of this data is here, and you can drill into this particular one and you can look at the notifications. I find this immensely useful for troubleshooting production problems without me having to poke around in the production system. I just bring it down to the local, and I can then work out what exactly has gone wrong. All right, sorry, I digress, but that's a useful function. I'm happy to share that technology as well, because the script that I've written could be repurposed for other scenarios, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think that would be a great article, or if it could be shared, definitely something I would use myself. Let me check. We have some people writing here.
I want this script. There you go. Useful. Yeah.
Indeed. Let's see.
Guillaume needs to start writing tests, he says, and he wants the copy job script as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Just a reminder for everybody in the shared notes, if you kind of have something that you want to remember or that you also kind of want to share from the talk, feel free to add, say, points to the talk, or because each of them is there available, plus, of course, the feedback. And also, Jan Kuster has already added some instructions to his upcoming workshop if you want to follow along.
Yeah, I'll copy that link and I'll put it in shared notes, right? Or do I just put it in the chat?
Put it in the shared notes, so that way people can later on see as well. Okay, I'll have one quick one more round if you have any questions, and then we'll have probably a break before the next talk, so that we keep to the schedule. Let me, Mike, I'm just going to move it up. There we go. Yeah, as I said, feel free to add any noise points or anything that will be used. It will be a good overview for anybody who comes afterwards. So let me check the chat if we have still see somebody writing. And a reminder, guys, this is the link to the Roti Express feedback form. So please let Mike know about any feedback that you might have for him. Give him a rating. That always helps. Let's see, what else do we have here? I think that's it. Mike, thank you very much for this interesting talk. Looking forward to where this is going to go to. And we'll wait for the next talk.